We now wrap up our look at the branches of philosophy with other branches, which contains everything else. Now, historically, there's been kind of a tradition of defining philosophy based on the region where the philosopher in question lived or lives, if they're still alive. So, for example, we might have German philosophy, English philosophy, continental philosophy, American philosophy, African philosophy, Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Japanese philosophy, etc. Now, while there are often similar views among people who live in the same area, there will obviously be a great deal of diversity between people, even who live in the same, country or even the same town or city. So some philosophers have questioned the value of dividing philosophy by these regions. But it is a long-standing tradition, and you'll find many anthologies based on the area where work has come from. Collections of African philosophy, collections of Eastern philosophy, collections of American philosophy, collections of continental philosophy. And again, one of the obvious concerns is that they're not grouped by, the intellectual content, because clearly someone could be from Kenya and have a position on, say, the problem of universals that's very similar to someone who is from Edinburgh. And likewise, there could be someone living in Edinburgh who totally disagrees with a philosopher that also lived in Edinburgh, etc. So there is an interesting question about the value of dividing up philosophy by these geographic regions. There are also gender and ethnic-based branches of philosophy. They're defined, obviously enough, in terms of the gender or ethnicity of the philosopher in question. Sometimes, though, they're classified based on the subject matter. So you might have a division based on the philosopher's gender or ethnicity, and then you also might have divided up based on philosophy of gender, philosophy of particular ethnicities. A good example, of course, would be feminism, which is a branch of philosophy that focuses on women and women's issues, although some assume it to be any philosophy done by a woman. There are also many varieties of feminism, and it's a mistake to assume that feminism is a monolithic doctrine shared by all feminists, and certainly it'd be a big mistake to assume it's a monolithic doctrine shared by all women. Now, of course, there are also divisions based on ethnicity, such as Hispanic philosophy, which is philosophy, depending on how you classify it, done by Hispanics and people of Hispanic origin, or focusing on philosophy of Hispanics and Hispanic issues, depending on how you classify this. Similarly, with African American philosophy, this is sometimes classified based on philosophy done by people who are African American. Also can be classified based on philosophy of African Americans and philosophy of African American issues. Likewise, for Native American philosophy, going with the divisions we looked at so far, could be philosophy done by people classified as Native Americans, or philosophy of Native Americans, or philosophy about what are considered to be Native American issues. And as you might imagine, breaking up philosophy by, gender, ethnicity, etc., is rather controversial and debated quite a bit. And there are those who, question making such divisions, but there are also those who defend them, arguing that it's important to have inclusivity and diversity in philosophy, and considering the ethnicity and gender of philosophers is a critical part of that. And so what branches we should have in philosophy and how we should split them up is a matter of considerable philosophical dispute. Now, there are many other content-based subdivisions or branches of philosophy. There's history of philosophy, which examines historical figures in philosophy from a historical perspective. And there's, of course, the classic joke about, when you're dead, you're history. So history of philosophy is about, dead philosophers, which is actually true. Now, the history of philosophy tends to focus on interpreting the views of philosophers, speculating on the origin of their views, and their impact on other thinkers. Some do claim that the historical views of philosophers should be treated the same way as we look at, say, historical scientific views or historical engineering views, important as historical steps, but now obsolete. And there are those who take an opposing viewpoint that contend that even if a philosopher has been dead a really long time, the content of their work should be looked at to see if it has merit today. And there are those who argue we should take the same approach to, say, science and engineering, that there are views in science and engineering that go way back that we would not consider obsolete. For example, to use kind of a silly example, the wheel is ancient yet hardly obsolete. There's also philosophy of language, which is obviously enough examining language philosophically, like what is language, how do we do language, etc. It's often connected to logic. There's also the philosophy of literature, which is looking at literature philosophically, philosophy of mathematics, which tends to overlap with logic, and includes such things as the metaphysical status of numbers. Plato and Pythagoras both argue that numbers are real. I don't mean the sense that you can write, the number 4 on a piece of paper or have a fridge magnet of the number 4, but in the sense that these are real metaphysical entities. And if you talk to a professional mathematician, someone who teaches it, does serious math, they'll probably have a view about whether numbers are real or not. Sometimes called a Platonic view of numbers, although it should probably be more seen as a Pythagorean view of numbers since he came first. There's also philosophy of mind, which I mentioned earlier, a subcategory of metaphysics. There's philosophy of religion, which is philosophically examining religion and religious issues. There's also philosophy of science, which is a matter of great controversy because sometimes scientists get rather annoyed by philosophers who try to tell them, like, hey, this is how you should do, your science stuff. And they would tend to think, hey, philosophers should stick with your, stick in your lane and do your philosophy stuff. There's also philosophy of anything. You can pretty much take anything and make it a philosophy of. There's philosophy of sports, there's philosophy of games, there's philosophy of Warcraft, there's philosophy of The Simpsons, there's philosophy of The Good Place, there's philosophy of The Matrix. And pretty much anything that there is, you could make a philosophy of. So, in theory, philosophy is infinite. So that takes us to the end of looking at the branches of philosophy. And now we'll turn to other matters of concern relating to philosophy, but now we're done with our branches.